Life in the colony. Until time allowed for the preparation of some kind of shelter, the vessels in which the early settlers came must have continued to be their abode, except for a few of the later immigrants who were without doubt taken into the cabins of their predecessors. A space of ground had to be cleared, and without delay, logs felled, out of which a house of the rudest sort was constructed. If there were other hands to assist, so much the better. But generally each man had all he could do to prepare a home for his own wife and children. Probably none of the earliest ordinary houses was more than 1 story in height or contained more than 1 room, the upper part being an attic room open to the pitch roof of thatch, grass, or bark, and reached by a movable ladder. A large chimney of stones was built on the outside at one end of the house, the lower portion forming a huge fireplace. The upper part of the chimney was often of wood. The windows were little more than holes a foot or 2 square, and the door was of plank hewn from the log. At first, the ordinary log house had no cellar. As ballast, 10,000 bricks and 2 loads of chalk were sent to Namkiag in 1628. There were also sent a large quantity of nails, a barrel of red lead for painting, a ton of iron, and 2 faggots of steel for the blacksmith to make into hinges, hasps, nails, etc. These various materials were worked into the early houses here. The imported bricks were used for hearths only. In the summer of 1629, a kiln for the burning of bricks and tiles was built by Thomas Trussler at what is now estate numbered 424 Essex Street, as brick clay was found there in quantity. He continued the business at that place until his death, which occurred in 1654. This is lot numbered 1 on plan of the layout of the town in 1629 at page 313. It was this kiln to which Reverend Francis Higginson referred in his New England's Plantation in 1629 when he wrote, "At this instant we are setting a brick kiln on work to make bricks and tiles for the building of our houses." For more than a century this lot was known as Brick Kiln Field, and after Boston Street was laid out in 1640 and the ancient road came into disuse in 1666, this part of Essex Street was called Brick Kiln Lane. After the manufacture of bricks was begun here, there were few, if any, importations of bricks and tiles from England. The furnishings of the dwellings were at first primitive, but through the inventiveness and skill of the settlers and the speedy importations of necessary articles from Europe, they soon improved. The clay floor of the first cabins was ornamented and more or less covered by carpets, some of which, according to the records, were striped, and within a decade, turkey carpets were to be found in some of the houses. There were red and green rugs and a white coarse rug besides mats. The family and guests slept in a row on the floor. If privacy were desired, blankets or sheets were hung to divide the room into compartments. Corded bedsteads were soon made, however, and the use of the trundle bed for children gave more room, since it was pushed under the bed during the day. Upon the tightly stretched cords of the bedstead was placed the canvas bedtick, which was filled with feathers or straw and sometimes with flock, coarse wool waste, and on the bed were sheets of fine or coarse canvas, linen, or holland. Blankets were common and generally white, but coverlets were often mixed in color. Quilts must have been rare, as only one is mentioned in the inventories of the estates of Salem people before 1650. Bolster ticks were filled with flock or feathers, and sometimes enclosed in cases. Pillows were filled with feathers. Pillow biers, cases, were made generally of flax, but sometimes of Scotch cloth, and ornamented with tassels. The best bed was often made with a frame above it, from which curtains were suspended. A ruffled valance was also hung around the bed. These were often made of green, say, material. Warming pans were used commonly to warm the chilly linen sheets upon retiring, and so are properly mentioned in connection with bed articles. The original table was simply a wide, thick board fastened at one side to the wall of the house near the fireplace by hinges, so that when not in use, it could be let down against the wall out of the way. Ordinary tables, sometimes circular in form, were soon made, however, and became common. The better ones were covered with a board cloth of flax, which before long came to be known as a tablecloth. The linen for the table was at first called board linen. The family linen generally included napkins of lockram, linen, and diaper cloth, and sometimes of holland. Occasionally they were fringed or embroidered. Towels were generally of tow, and sometimes ornamented by handwork. Tapestry coverings were rarely found, but cushions were common. A great cushion wrought with worsted is early mentioned. Cupboard cloths and cupboard cushions are early and frequently mentioned. In the inventory of the estate of William Clark of Salem in 1647 are named a sempiternum, everlasting or perpetual cupboard cloth with silk fringe and 2 cupboard cushions, one of damask and the other of needlework. Chairs were scarce, and stools and plank seats, called forms, served for seats until better means could be provided. Settles soon came into use. Looking glasses were rare indeed. Trunks were common, and there was one piece of furniture, the chest, which was brought to America by each family, serving as a receptacle for small belongings on the ship. These chests continue to be very useful in the houses in the new land. Some were beautifully wainscoted and made of English black oak, but most of them were plain. After 3 centuries, some of these ancient chests are in use and treasured in the homes of descendants of the first settlers. 2 of these, which are extant today, were without doubt brought over by Captain William Trask, who came with Endicott in 1628. One of them remained on the old homestead in Salem until 1870, when it was taken to Boston, where it is now in the possession of the Museum of Fine Arts. The other remains in the neighborhood in which Captain Trask lived, and is in the possession of Lyman P. Osborne of Peabody. The ancient sideboard, which is said to have been brought to Salem from England by John Putnam about 1638, descended to Mrs. Harriet Fowler of Danvers, and from her to her daughter Harriet Putnam Fowler, who gave it to the Essex Institute at Salem, which has possessed it for more than a score of years. The ancient cradle, used in the family of Geoffrey Massey in Salem, is now in the possession of the Massachusetts Historical Society in Boston, having been given to it in 1799 by the Massey family. It measures 3 feet in length and 1 foot in width at the bottom, and is made of oak. It is now in a dilapidated condition. In the fireplace, a fire of logs laid upon stones, until andirons or iron fire dogs were brought over, warmed the room and cooked the food. Sea coal and charcoal also were used somewhat. Starting fire was not always easy. The flint and steel, tinderbox, and light kindling were all necessary, and often a long and aggravating operation was the cost of the fire. Accompanying the fireplace were tongs, shovel, and bellows. For light, other than that obtained from the hearth fire, the first settlers learned from the Indians to use pine tree splints made of short sections of pine cloven into thin slices. The pitch in them burned like a torch. Tallow candles were little used, except by the wealthier people, until beef tallow became common. Then, of course, candlesticks also increased in number. These were frequently made of brass. There were here very early, too, pewter and brass lamps, in which grease was probably burned. The ancient perforated tin lantern is still sometimes seen. Suspended upon a spit and turned by hand before the hearth fire were roasted fish and venison and other meats. The jack, a mechanical contrivance for constant turning of the meat, was occasionally found in Salem. The coarse bread was baked upon some flat surfaces as of a piece of plank slanted towards the fire. Some of the immigrants brought great and small pots and kettles of iron, copper, or brass with them, and suspending them over the fire in the fireplace on pot hangers or hooks, boiled therein their meat, fish, lobsters, oysters, clams, green and dry corn, beans and peas, turnips, parsnips, carrots, and pumpkins, or made their hasty pudding or other mush, pea or bean porridge, soup or broth from salt beef, and pork mixed with cornmeal, or brewed beer for a beverage when they desired something stronger than water. Baking was done in an oven of stone, later of brick, built into the house besides the fireplace. Sometimes, probably at the very first, the oven was made of stone in the ground near the house. In either case, a fire was built in the oven, and when the stones were sufficiently heated, the remains of the fire were removed, and the prepared food placed therein to remain for some 20 hours, until it had become thoroughly cooked. This slow process gave a flavor to the food which is unequaled by any other method of cooking, ancient or modern. In this manner, the Indian pudding or English plum pudding and brown bread, pandowdy, and beans were baked. When the oven was built by the side of the chimney and was large, the earthen pots were carried to or drawn from their place in the oven by a long-handled flat iron shovel called a peel. It was so thin and flat that it could be quickly pushed under the pots or jerked away without disturbing their equilibrium. In one of the early families in Salem was a great pewter pot, in another a chafing dish, in another a jug pot, and in another a double salt cellar. Earthen pots and pans and other earthenware were early made here, and china dishes soon reached the houses of the settlers. The kneading trough was an important utensil, and so were the mortar and pestle, which were sometimes of brass, bowls, mugs, and wooden, iron, and silver spoons, and the child's porringer for use in eating soups, broths, oatmeal, and other kinds of porridge were common. The pewter porringer and its cover, shown herewith, reduced to 1/4 its size, is in the possession of the Essex Institute at Salem. It is said to have belonged to Henry Herrick, the immigrant who came in 1629. Saucers were rare. There were pewter plates and platters. Upon wooden plates or trenchers, solid food was cut with a knife. There were no forks. Wooden plates were easily made from a pine log cut into sections 10 or 12 inches long and split into slices about an inch thick. These were left square, generally, though they were sometimes rounded and frequently were slightly hollowed. Other dishes and platters were sometimes made similarly. The frying pan, brass pan, baking iron, brass or iron skillet, gridiron, dripping pan, skimmer, and sieve were in most of the kitchens, and the cooper soon furnished tubs, pails, buckets, kegs, barrels, runlets, and hogsheads. Flagons and silver beakers were in the possession of the wealthier families. Drinking horns were used in the house of Reverend Mr. Skelton, and probably they were not uncommon. Within the house, the wife did what she could with the means at hand to properly prepare and conduct her household, and without, the husband gave his attention to other things. A shelter had to be secured for the domestic animals as cows, oxen, horses, sheep, swine, goats, and hens, which he had brought with him or had obtained after his arrival. The house, barn, and other shelter had to be as strong as possible for protection from the bear, wolf, and fox. Some of the planters called their cows by pet names, which indicates the individual interest shown in them. John Balch had 2 cows, which he called Reddy and Cherry. If a good spring were conveniently near, water for ordinary and other household purposes and for the cattle could be obtained from that source most easily, but unless houses were located near such a supply, wells had to be dug. From wells, water was drawn by a bucket attached to a pole or chain. Each settler made a clearing in which to erect a house and other buildings and to plant his seed. The mattock and spade were the principal implements for preparation of the ground after the trees had been felled and burned. The wooden plow and harrow were soon made and used, however. Fences had to be built around buildings and sometimes a garden. Other tools of the settler consisted of broad and narrow hoes, broad and felling axes, hatchets, thwart, hand and whip saws, stone and ordinary hammers, planes, shovels, reaping hooks, scythes, rakes, pickaxes, augers, spoke shaves, chisels, wrenches, piercers, drills, punches, files, trowels, frowls, handbills, beetles, and wedges. Associated with the dairy were milk pans, cheese press, and churn. Vehicles were rare. The rivers and bay were the first thoroughfares, and they were traversed by canoe, dugout, and boat. On land, people ordinarily traveled on horseback, mother and child sometimes riding upon a pillion behind the father who was in the saddle. 2-wheeled carts were the first wheel vehicle for both traveling and field work. The tip cart, or tumbril, which it was originally called, and hand carts were the first vehicles used on the farm. In winter, when the snow lay upon the ground, sleds were used for traveling and for hauling loads. These were large and clumsy, but good to pave the snow and make smooth roads. To a limited extent, clothing had been brought with the immigrants, but soon new articles were needed. These supplies were slow in coming, and patched clothes became common. An argument that afforded some consolation in the wintertime found expression in this line: patched clothes are warmer than single-hole clothing. The attire worn every day by both sexes was plain and simple, but at other times was remarkably bright and attractive. The people liked pretty things, and although they made their own clothing of the few and unsatisfactory materials they could obtain, they used various dyes to make it showy. From the Indians, they learned of roots and berries that would produce holiday colors, and Governor Endicott introduced the troublesome wood wax for a similar purpose. There was also the indigo plant. Ornaments and jewelry were not common, and all superfluities were for some years necessarily absent. The wool for their clothing came from their own sheep. This they spun upon the woolen wheel. Cotton was early obtained, and that was spun upon the cotton wheel. They raised their own flax for their linen. This had to be broken by a flax brake, and the woody stalk cleared from the fiber by a swingle knife and hatchel, through which it was pulled. Then it was carded, that is, combed. This produced tow, which had to be spun upon the spinning wheel The loom for weaving was not very common in the earlier days. It was very large and required much room, and was made at considerable expense and good workmanship. Weaving also required more skill than spinning. The man wore a loose-fitting coat called a doublet, which reached a little below the hips, and was so called because it lay in folds over the larger part of the body of the person. Beneath the doublet was worn a long, full waistcoat. Trousers were large and extended to just below the knee, and held by cords or garters. About the neck, a broad white collar, called a falling band, was worn. It was sometimes prepared with wire and stiffened with starch, that it might stand out horizontally, and was usually held by a cord and tassel at the neck. A great cloak added warmth in winter. The hat had a narrow brim and a conical crown. A proper outfit for a man, as an emigrant to New England, consisted of 3 suits, one of a sort of canvas, one of frieze, and the other of cloth. 3 shirts, a waistcoat, 3 pairs of stockings, 4 pairs of shoes, 3 falling bands, and a Monmouth cap. Some of the clothing was of cloth, and some of leather. A large amount of clothing was provided by the company for the men who were sent to Namkiag. There were 400 shirts, 400 pairs of shoes, 300 pairs of stockings, 200 of which were of Irish make, and 100 knit, 10 dozen Norwich garters, 100 suits of doublets and hose of leather, lined with oiled skin leather, the hose and doublets made with hooks and eyes, 100 suits of Nordhausen or Hampshire kersey, the hose lined with skins, and the doublets with linen, and other suits of Guildford or Gedliman kersey, 400 plain bands, 100 of which were falling bands, 100 green cotton waistcoats bound with red tape, 100 leather girdles, 100 mandilions lined with white cotton, 100 leather suits of doublets and breeches of oiled leather, 100 pairs of breeches of leather to wear with either of the other suits, 100 Monmouth caps, 500 red knit milled caps, 100 black hats lined in front with leather, 200 dozen hooks and eyes and small hooks and eyes for mandilions, 16 dozen gloves, 12 of calfskin, 2 of sheep, and 2 of kid. There were also sent linen for handkerchiefs, a bale of French cloth, and linen and woolen cloth. Materials for clothing and other supplies here in the earliest days were English jean, red, perpetuance, lawn, say kersey, of various colors, Court Holland, Lockram, linsey woolsey, cotton cloth, broadcloth, trucking cloth, buckram, striped calico, Norwich serge, Dutch serge, stuff, white flannel, baize, cambric, and fustian. The dress of the women was in general much the same as it has been ever since that time. The earliest gowns here were blue, chaney, black, grogram, sad-colored kersey, mixed-color cloth, russet cloth, and purple cloth, and lined with green say. Under the skirt was worn a stuff or green kersey petticoat, although sometimes blue, red, or purple in color, and one is mentioned as having 3 laces about it. Another petticoat is described as stamel kersey, mitered about the skirt with velvet. Over the waist was worn a waistcoat made of serge, cotton shag, or holland, white, red, black, or purple in color, and sometimes trimmed with lace. Aprons were common, being white, blue, green, russet, or tawny in color, and made of shag, calico, say, linsey, woolsey, and holland, and fleecy holland. They were sometimes trimmed with lace. Cloaks and girdles were worn, some of the latter being made of silk and embroidered. There were whalebone bodices, stockings knit or made of cloth, boots sometimes russet in color, stomachers of white stuff, and occasionally wrought neckcloths and handkerchiefs bordered with lace and mittens or gloves of cotton or white knit thread. A headdress called a coif was worn, being cut-worked or bordered with lace, white or black in color, and made of grogram, stuff, or holland. Caps or hoods were also known as coifs and were made of kersey, sometimes red in color. The supplies of the household were not confined to the meat, fish, and vegetables already mentioned. Many of the families had powdered and loaf sugar and spices as pepper, ginger, clove, mace, cinnamon, and nutmeg. Some of their butter in Holland and other kinds of cheese was imported, and some they made. They brought bacon with them, but afterwards cured their own. They dried herring and other fish, vinegar and Gallipoli, Majorque, and salad oil they brought with them. White salt was imported and also found evaporated from the seawater upon the rocks. Materials for soap, ashes, and saltpeter were found in abundance, thus making further importation of soap unnecessary. Growing in the grass were strawberries, pennyroyal, winter savory, sorrel, brook lime, liverwort, carvel, and watercresses. Leeks and onions were common. Various fruits as mulberries, plums, raspberries, currants, hurtleberries, and haws of white thorn and nuts, chestnuts, filberts, walnuts, and several small varieties were common. Raisins and prunes were imported. There were excellent vines in the woods, and Captain Endicott planted a vineyard, as well as apple and pear trees, immediately upon his arrival at Namkiag. The company sent over Malaga, Canary, and Spanish wines, and other drinks were aquavitae, brandy, and a drink made of honey and water fermented with yeast called metheglin. The environment was delightful during the summer season especially, and in the autumn the New England foliage was a happy surprise. In the woods and clearings were abundant sweet plants and flowers, especially sweet damask roses. Undoubtedly, roots and seeds of flowering shrubs and flowers from the English gardens were soon planted around the cabins. The company sent over plenty of field seeds for planting, so that the settlers had no lack of several kinds of seed when the ground was ready to be planted. There were a hogshead each of wheat, rye, barley, oats, beans, and peas. There were also sent stones of peaches, plums, and cherries, pear and apple seeds, filberts, quince kernels, and pomegranates, saffron heads, mustard and licorice seed, madder roots and seed, sweet potatoes, hop roots, flax seed, and currant plants. A native hemp was found fit for making cordage and cloth, but the company also sent over seed of their cultivated hemp for planting. The seed brought in the several vessels in 1629 arrived rather late for planting, yet much of it came to fruition, growing quickly in the sheltered clearings. Maize was the most important crop for the sustenance of the people. The old planters and the Indians had plenty of it for seed, and also seeds of pumpkins, peas, beans, and other vegetables. Seeds of fruit trees were planted, and orchards of apple, pear, plum, and peach were soon growing. Those were busy days. The people had no intention of making the settlement a camp simply. Their whole attitude was that of builders of a permanent abode for themselves and their posterity. Several kinds of business were being carried on among these husbandmen. Trade was transacted with the Indians for furs of beaver, otter, and other animals. Shipbuilding was one of the very first enterprises because of its necessity. Vessels furnished not only the means of communication between the continents, but along the coasts, in the bays, and on the rivers. Boats and canoes were the vehicles prior to the existence of roads, and were easily propelled. In April 1629, the company sent to Salem 6 shipwrights, Robert Moulton being the head one. Pitch, tar, resin, oakum, cordage, and sailcloth were sent over in the summer of 1629 in charge of George Farr. Most of the settlers had their own nets or signs, hooks, and lines for their private use, but fishing was also carried on as a business. In the summer of 1629, Governor Endicott was requested to secure shallops for the use of the 6 fishermen who were sent over from Dorchester and 3 others who were to be sent later, and some of the ship's company to salt the fish, pack it in hogsheads or otherwise, and send it to England in the ships Lyons, Whelp, and Talbot, in each of which had been sent over 5 way of salt. There had also arrived in the ship Mayflower 11 way of salt, 4 Sisters 15, and Pilgrim 3, with signs, lines, hooks, knives, boots, and barrels necessary for fishing in the harbor or upon the banks. Coopers were busy from the first, and wheelwrights prepared for the simplest uses of wheels and carts. Shoemaker Thomas Beard brought some hides in the Mayflower for both soles and uppers, which he made into boots and shoes. Men skillful in making pitch and salt and vine planters were also secured and sent to Namkiag. Able men for these duties were always sought. The business of making salt was reserved for the benefit of the general stock, although each planter of the company was to have as much as he had occasion to use, as cheaply as he himself could make it. And if the company had not enough to supply the demand of the colonists, the latter were given liberty to make salt at their own expense, for their own use, but not to transport or sell it. All were to labor, that they might be aided by so doing in living uprightly as well as for material benefits. Each one had to apply himself to some calling, and no idle drone was permitted to live among them. A daily register was kept in each family of what was done by each person in it. The reason of the objection to the playing of cards and the use of dice apparently was to economize time as well as to improve morals. The playing of games of chance possessed certain fascinations which other games lacked, and so drew the attention of the people away from their occupations and unfitted them for steady employment. The Court of Assistance, March 22nd, 1630-31, ordered that all persons whatsoever that have cards, dice, or tables in their houses should make away with them before the next court under pain of punishment. One purpose of the early laws was to prevent idleness by compelling workmen to labor in order to earn enough to support themselves and their families. The theory was that idleness was an occasion of excess and mischief, and occupation was useful in many ways, direct and indirect. In the general letters to Governor Endicott, the company in England directed the constant employment of the planters and their families. October 1st, 1633, the General Court ordered that no householder or other person should spend his time idly nor unprofitably, and the constables were to be specially careful and diligent to learn of offenders in this thing, especially of common coasters, unfittable fowlers, and tobacco takers, and present them to the court. Swearing and drunkenness were prohibited and punished. At this time, the following named crimes were punished capitally: idolatry, witchcraft, blasphemy, murder, bestiality, sodomy, adultery, rape, man-stealing, false witness, conspiracy or rebellion against the government, cursing or smiting father or mother after passing 16 years of age, unless with justifying provocation, for unchristian neglect in education, and filial rebellion after 16 years of age. The only means of telling time was by the sun's shadow, sometimes by the upright, inclined, or horizontal stick in the dial, but more often by the notched window sill, and the calendar of the month and year was made by marking the shortening or lengthening shadows on the floor through the seasons. Governor Endicott had a sundial, which was made for him and is now in the Museum of the Essex Institute. It is made of brass, and octagonal in form. It is inscribed William Bowyer of London, clockmaker, Fecit I 1630E. On one side of the gnomon is latitude 42, and on the other, Salem. Nighttime had no measure except the hourglass. Sunday was observed religiously. All labor ceased at 3 o'clock on Saturday afternoon, and the rest of the day was spent in catechizing and preparation for the Sabbath, as the ministers directed. Family worship was held morning and evening. Life must have been lacking in many ways mentally. In some houses there was a book or two on some religious subject, but in many of them there was hardly a page of reading matter, and pictures were almost unknown. The little instruction the children had, if any, was received from their parents and consisted of reading and writing the simplest words and learning enough of numbers to enable them to meet the ordinary problems of everyday life. There were no school books. Playthings, games, and other amusements for children were practically unknown. There was no time for fancy work by the wives and daughters of the immigrants. The fine sampler now in the Essex Institute, wrought by Anna Gower, Governor Endicott's first wife, and shown above, was probably made in England. Musical instruments were not found among the early settlers, and the singing of psalms was the only music heard. Social life was confined to meeting together at the religious services. The people were too few, too busy, and too far apart to indulge in formal society. Funerals were almost fete days, and largely attended not only out of respect for the deceased and sympathy for the bereaved, but because of the social privileges.